The desert wind carried the scent of death that scorching summer day in 1878, when Dahlia Norwood opened her eyes to find herself in a shallow grave at the edge of Wood River, Nebraska. Her last memory had been of gunfire, pain searing through her chest, and then darkness, the cold, endless darkness that she'd believed was her eternal fate. "I thought I was dead," she cried, her voice barely a whisper, as she stared up at the tall figure silhouetted against the merciless sun. The cowboy knelt beside her, his weathered face softening as he gently brushed the dirt from her pale cheeks. Then, "This is your first breath back," he said, his voice deep and steady as the drumbeat of a distant storm. Dahlia's fingers trembled as they reached for the spot where she remembered the bullet striking. There was blood dried now, but no wound, just a small scar that looked weeks old. How long had she been buried? How was she still alive? "Name's Thomas Irving," the cowboy said, offering her his canteen. "Most folks call me Trace, and you, madam, are the first person I've ever dug up who wasn't dead to begin with." She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and onto her dirt-caked blouse. "Dahlia," she managed between gulps. "Dahlia Norwood." Trace nodded, his eyes green as summer sage scanning the horizon. "Well, Miss Norwood, someone sure wanted folks to think you were gone. Lucky for you, my horse has a peculiar habit of stopping at fresh graves." He adjusted his hat. "And luckier still that whoever put you here didn't dig deep enough or check careful enough to make sure you were actually departed." Dahlia tried to stand, but found her legs unwilling to support her weight. Without hesitation, Trace scooped her into his arms. She weighed nothing to him, a man accustomed to wrestling steers and breaking wild horses. "Please," she whispered, clutching weakly at his leather vest. "They can't know I'm alive. The Stillwell brothers, they'll kill me for real this time." Trace's jaw tightened. The Stillwells were infamous throughout Nebraska territory, cattle rustlers, land grabbers, and worse. They'd been terrorizing Wood River for nearly 2 years now. "Madam," he said, setting her gently on his horse, "I don't know what trouble you're in with the Stillwells, but I give you my word, they won't touch you again." As they rode toward his small ranch just outside town, Dahlia drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of memory returning like shards of broken glass. She remembered the schoolhouse where she taught, the children's faces, and then the Stillwells arriving one afternoon, demanding she sell them her late father's land that contained the only reliable water source for miles around. When she'd refused, they'd threatened her. When she'd still refused, they'd shot her and left her for dead. Or so they thought. Trace's cabin was modest but clean. He laid Dahlia on his bed and brought her fresh water and a bowl of stew he'd had simmering on the stove. "You need to regain your strength," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Then we can figure out what to do about the Stillwells." Dahlia's hands shook as she spooned the stew into her mouth. "They think they've won," she said. "My father's deed is hidden where they'll never find it. But now," her voice broke, "now I don't know if I have the courage to stand against them again." Trace sat beside the bed, his presence oddly comforting for a man she'd just met. "Miss Norwood, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." For the first time since awakening in that shallow grave, Dahlia felt something besides fear, a flicker of hope, kindled by this stranger's unwavering certainty. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." A shadow crossed Trace's face. "Let's just say I've got my own score to settle with the Stillwells." As night fell, Dahlia's fever spiked. Trace placed cool cloths on her forehead and kept watch, his rifle across his knees. In her delirium, she spoke of her childhood in Boston, her father bringing her west after her mother died, how she'd taken up teaching in Wood River to keep the small homestead her father had built with his bare hands. "It's not just land," she murmured. "It's my heritage, my future." "I understand," Trace replied, though he wondered if she could hear him through her fever. "My father had a ranch south of here, finest grazing land in 3 counties. The Stillwells wanted it. When he refused to sell, they burned him out. He died in that fire." Dahlia's eyes fluttered open, surprisingly clear. "So, that's why you're helping me." "Part of it," he admitted. "But mostly because leaving someone in a grave ain't right, especially when they're still breathing." By morning, Dahlia's fever had broken. She sat up in bed, her strength returning faster than either of them expected. "I need to go back to my home," she said. "The deed is hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards in my father's study." Trace shook his head. "The Stillwells will be watching your place, and besides, folks in town think you're dead. If you show up now, word will spread faster than wildfire." "Then what do you suggest?" Her voice was stronger now, some of her natural determination returning. "I suggest we get that deed without anyone knowing you're alive. Then we take it straight to Judge Morrison in Lincoln. He's one of the few honest men with enough backbone to stand up to the Stillwells." Dahlia considered his plan. "How do we get the deed without anyone seeing me?" A slow smile spread across Trace's face. "People see what they expect to see, Miss Norwood, and no one expects to see a ghost." That night, under a moonless sky, they rode to Dahlia's homestead. The house stood dark and silent, seemingly abandoned since her death 2 days earlier. "Stay close," Trace whispered as they approached. "If there's trouble, we run. No heroics." But the house was empty. The Stillwells, confident in their victory, hadn't posted a guard. Dahlia moved through the familiar rooms, a strange sensation overwhelming her, like she was indeed a ghost haunting her own home. In her father's study, she knelt and pried up the loose floorboard, revealing a small metal box. "Here it is," she breathed, clutching the deed to her chest. "Father's life's work. My inheritance." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Trace drew his revolver in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Dahlia and the door. "Well, well," came a gravelly voice. "Looks like we got ourselves a grave robber." Jeb Stillwell stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the exit. Behind him, his younger brother Eli grinned maliciously, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "Irving," Jeb spat. "Should have known you'd be sniffing around now that the schoolmarm's gone." Dahlia remained crouched behind Trace, her face hidden in the shadows. "Just collecting some personal effects for Miss Norwood's family back east," Trace said evenly, his gun never wavering. Jeb took a step forward. "Funny, we heard she didn't have no family. That's why we figured nobody would miss her much when she had her unfortunate accident." "That wasn't no accident," Eli cackled. "I put that bullet in her myself." Something snapped in Dahlia. She stood, stepping into the lamplight, her face pale but resolute. "Then your aim needs work, Eli Stillwell," she said coldly. The color drained from both brothers' faces. That's impossible," Jeb stammered. "We buried you." "Not deep enough," Trace said, his finger steady on the trigger. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Eli raised his shotgun. Trace fired first, the bullet striking Eli's shoulder. Jeb lunged for Dahlia, but she was quicker than anyone expected, sidestepping his charge and bringing a heavy bookend down on his head. Jeb collapsed, dazed but conscious. Eli writhed on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "We need to tie them up and get to Lincoln," Trace said, already retrieving rope from his saddlebag. "They won't stay down for long." As they rode through the night, Dahlia clutched the deed in one hand and Trace's waist with the other. Behind them, the Stillwell brothers remained bound in her father's study, where the sheriff summoned by a note Trace had left with his neighbor would find them come morning. "Will this really work?" Dahlia asked as dawn broke over the eastern plains, Lincoln's distant outline appearing on the horizon. "Will a judge believe that I survived being shot and buried?" Trace glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting hers. "Judge Morrison's a practical man. He'll believe what he sees with his own eyes, a woman very much alive and with a legal deed to land. The Stillwell brothers tried to steal through murder. Judge Morrison indeed proved to be a practical man. After listening to Dahlia's account and examining her wound, now clearly healing, and the deed to her property, he immediately issued warrants for the Stillwells' arrest on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy. "Miss Norwood," the judge said, his white eyebrows furrowing, "you realize that returning to Wood River might be uncomfortable. News of your resurrection will cause quite a stir." Dahlia straightened her shoulders. "Wood River is my home, Your Honor. I've already died once for it. I'm certainly not abandoning it now." Outside the courthouse, Trace helped her onto his horse. "You know," he said quietly, "my offer still stands. You could stay at my place until things settle down. Might be safer." Dahlia studied his face, the face of a man who had pulled her from a grave, who had risked his life to help a woman he barely knew, who had shown her what true courage looked like. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But not because I'm afraid, because I'd like to know more about the man who gave me my first breath back." The journey back to Wood River was tense but uneventful. News traveled fast in the Nebraska Territory, and by the time they arrived, everyone knew that Dahlia Norwood had miraculously survived her encounter with the Stillwells, who were now in custody awaiting trial. Some townsfolk crossed the street to avoid her, as if she truly were a ghost that might bring ill fortune. Others embraced her, tears in their eyes, grateful that one of the town's few educated citizens, and certainly its best teacher, had returned from the dead. Through it all, Trace remained at her side, a steady presence as she reclaimed her life and her home. Summer faded into autumn, and as the prairie grasses turned golden, Dahlia reopened the schoolhouse. The children, less encumbered by superstition than their parents, welcomed her back with open arms and eager minds. Trace began stopping by after school, first with the excuse of helping repair the weathered building, then simply to walk her home, their conversations stretching longer with each passing day. "Why did you become a teacher?" he asked one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "I believe education is the greatest gift one person can give another," she replied. "Knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you, not even if they bury you alive." Trace's laugh was warm in the cool evening air. "You know, for someone who's been through what you have, you don't seem bitter." Dahlia considered this. "I was given a second chance at life, Mr. Irving. That's not something I take lightly." "Trace," he corrected her gently. "After pulling someone from a grave, I think we can dispense with formalities." Their first kiss came weeks later, on the anniversary of her father's death. Trace had found her at the cemetery, placing wildflowers on both her father's grave and the now empty one that had briefly been her own. "It's strange," she said as he approached, "standing at your own grave. Makes you think about what matters." Without a word, Trace took her hand, and then, as naturally as breathing, they moved toward each other, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Winter arrived harsh and early that year. Blizzards isolated Wood River for weeks at a time, but Dahlia found she didn't mind. Her small house, once so lonely after her father's passing, was now filled with Trace's presence most evenings as they read by lamplight, planned improvements to both their properties, and slowly, cautiously, fell in love. "I've been thinking," Trace said one night as snow piled against the windows. "Your land and mine, they're not far apart. Good water on yours, good grazing on mine." Dahlia looked up from the essay she was grading. "Mr. Irving, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were suggesting a merger." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Maybe I am. A business arrangement, to start." By spring, when the prairie exploded with wildflowers, their business arrangement had blossomed into something far deeper. Trace proposed properly on Easter Sunday, after church service, in front of the entire town. "Miss Dahlia Norwood," he said, dropping to one knee in the churchyard, "you've already lived 2 lives. I'm hoping you might spend your 3rd one with me." Their wedding, held in June of 1879, became something of a local legend. The entire town turned out even those who had initially avoided the woman who came back from the dead. The schoolchildren sang, the women of Wood River prepared a feast that stretched across 3 tables, and Judge Morrison himself rode all the way from Lincoln to perform the ceremony. "Never thought I'd be marrying a woman whose death certificate I had to officially nullify," the judge chuckled during the ceremony, bringing appreciative laughter from the crowd. As Dahlia and Trace exchanged vows beneath an arbor woven with prairie roses, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward the celebration. The crowd parted as Sheriff Wilson dismounted, his expression grim but satisfied. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, nodding to the newlyweds. "Just got word from the state prison. The Stillwells were being transferred to serve their 20-year sentences. Tried to escape." He paused. "Both shot dead." A murmur ran through the crowd. Trace's arm tightened around Dahlia's waist. "Thank you for telling us, Sheriff," Dahlia said quietly. "Now, if you'll join us for the celebration." Later, as they danced under the stars, Trace pulled her close. "Are you all right about the Stillwells?" Dahlia rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I don't wish death on anyone," she said softly. "But I won't mourn the men who tried to steal my life." She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "Besides, in a strange way, I owe them. How do you figure that? If they hadn't shot me and left me for dead, you wouldn't have found me, and I wouldn't have found you." Trace's smile was tender as he brushed a curl from her face. "Well, when you put it that way, maybe I should send flowers to their graves." Life settled into a rhythm for the Irvings. They maintained her father's homestead, but built a new, larger house halfway between her property and his ranch. Their combined lands, as Trace had predicted, flourished with good water and good grazing. Dahlia continued teaching, adding adult education classes in the evenings, for those in town who had never had the opportunity to learn to read or write. Trace expanded his cattle operation, breeding stronger stock, better suited to the harsh Nebraska winters. In the winter of 1880, their first child was born a son they named James, after Dahlia's father. 2 years later came twins, a boy and a girl, Samuel and Sarah. Each birth reinforced what Dahlia had known since that moment she opened her eyes in that shallow grave. Every breath was precious, every moment a gift. The legend of Dahlia Norwood Irving, the woman who came back from the dead, grew over the years, embellished with each telling. Some said she had died completely and been resurrected by an angel disguised as a cowboy. Others claimed she had made a deal with the devil to return and seek vengeance on the Stillwells. Dahlia herself never discouraged the stories. "Let them talk," she told Trace. "If it brings a little mystery to Wood River, where's the harm?" In truth, the doctor who later examined her wound believed the bullet had grazed her heart, but missed by millimeters. The shock and blood loss had rendered her unconscious, her pulse and breathing so faint that the Stillwells, in their haste, had mistaken her for dead. A medical curiosity, the doctor had called it, a 1 in a million chance of survival. But Trace had his own theory. "Some souls are just too stubborn to leave this earth before their time," he'd say, usually when Dahlia was being particularly headstrong about something. As the years passed, Wood River grew from a struggling settlement into a prosperous town. The railroad came through in 1885, bringing new opportunities and new settlers. Dahlia's school expanded to 3 rooms with 2 additional teachers. Trace's cattle operation became one of the most respected in the state. Through it all, they remained at the center of the community, their story of second chances and enduring love, inspiring others who face their own hardships on the frontier. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Trace surprised Dahlia with a trip back east, her first return to Boston since leaving as a child. They visited the graves of her mother and grandparents, toured the city of her birth, and even attended an opera, something Dahlia had dreamed of since reading about such performances in books. But it was on their return journey, as the train crossed back into Nebraska territory, that Dahlia realized a fundamental truth. "I thought I would feel something stronger, returning to where I was born," she told Trace, as they watched the familiar landscape of the plains unfold outside their window. "But this is my home now. This is where I died and where I was reborn, where we built our life together." Trace took her hand, his fingers tracing the small scar on her chest that remained her only physical reminder of the day in 1878. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he asked. "About how close I came to riding past that fresh grave. If midnight hadn't stopped, if I hadn't noticed the shallow digging. But you did," she said simply. "You found me. You gave me that first breath back." In 1893, 15 years after Dahlia's resurrection, a journalist from a Chicago newspaper arrived in Wood River, having heard the story of the woman who returned from the dead. He sought out the Irvings, now prominent citizens with 4 children and one of the most successful ranching operations in the state. "Mrs. Irving," the young reporter asked, notebook in hand, "looking back now, what do you think about your extraordinary experience? Do you believe it was divine intervention, fate, mere luck?" Dahlia, now in her late 30s with streaks of silver in her dark hair, considered the question as she sat on the porch of the home she and Trace had built, watching their children playing in the yard with the dogs. "I believe," she said carefully, "that life offers us moments of grace, moments when the impossible becomes possible, when what should be an ending turns into a beginning." She smiled at Trace, who sat beside her, his hand resting comfortably on hers. "My husband once told me that Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. And do you still believe that? The reporter asked. More than ever, she replied. Every morning when I wake up, I remember that I'm living a life I wasn't supposed to have. Every breath is a gift. Every day is borrowed time. She squeezed Trace's hand, and I'm determined not to waste a single moment of it. The reporter left with his story, which ran in newspapers across the country, bringing a brief flurry of curiosity seekers to Wood River. But soon enough, life returned to its comfortable rhythm. As they grew older, Dahlia and Trace watched their children mature, the town prosper, and the 19th century give way to the 20th. James, their eldest, took over most of the ranching operations. Samuel became a doctor, inspired by his mother's miraculous survival. Sarah followed in her mother's footsteps as a teacher, while their youngest, Emma, surprised everyone by becoming one of the first female lawyers in Nebraska. In 1918, 40 years after Dahlia had opened her eyes in that shallow grave, she and Trace sat together on their porch swing, watching a spectacular sunset paint the prairie sky. "Do you ever wonder," Trace asked, his voice still strong, though his hair had turned completely white, "what our lives would have been like if we'd met some other way? If you'd never been shot? If I'd never found you half buried?" Dahlia leaned against his shoulder, the familiar warmth of him as comforting now as it had been all those decades ago. "I used to," she admitted. "But then I realized it doesn't matter. What matters is what we did with the life we were given. And I'd say we did pretty well, Thomas Irving." He chuckled, the sound as rich and warm as it had been when he was a young man. "Pretty well indeed, Dahlia Irving." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Dahlia thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her here, from the brink of death to a life fuller and more beautiful than she could have imagined. She thought about the shallow grave that should have been her end, but instead became her beginning. About the cowboy who'd given her that first breath back and every moment of joy that followed. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dahlia took a deep, appreciative breath, savoring it as she had savored every breath since that day in 1878, when she had been given a second chance at life and at love.